Thanks everyone so very much for joining. My name is Ali Van Duren and I am here from Korn Ferry to talk a little bit about our organization and answer questions you have. But really this session is all about negotiation and getting paid what you're worth. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and stop my video for bandwidth purposes while I share my screen here. I'll be back on shortly. And I have a little bit of a presentation here, but I really wanna hear ultimately from you all at the end here. So we've got a fairly small intimate group. So feel free to ask any questions in our chat too. And if everyone can go on mute, that would be very helpful. Perfect. So I'll start just with an introduction to myself. I'm Ali Van Duren. I've been with Korn Ferry for just over 5 years now. You can see that I do love coming on campus, so I do wish that I was there in person. I am in grad school at USC, so I am part of the Trojan family, so I'm pretty excited to be with you all today. But I sit within the consulting side of our business within digital talent acquisition and products. I also support university relations efforts as well, which is how I get to speak with you all today. But really, my role has shifted in my 5 years at Korn Ferry, which I'll talk more about the firm in a little bit. But started as truly a talent acquisition specialist, so doing a lot of phone interviews and screening, and then moved to doing really full cycle campus recruiting, university relations, both internally at the firm as well as for our clients throughout North America. And then about 2.5 years ago, I transitioned more into the consulting side of our business, partnering with our clients in the US and outside of the US as well, but primarily in the US on all of their digital tools and technologies, really finding the best solution and tech stack for them, all relating to the talent space. So that's a little bit about me, and my contact information is there. I'll share it at the end as well. But here to talk a lot about Korn Ferry and a lot about negotiation today. So just a little bit of a background into our organization. I guess from a show of hands, either through your video or just through Zoom, who is somewhat familiar with Korn Ferry? And no worries, I won't be quizzing anybody, but just curious to see kind of, by a show of hands, how many of y'all are somewhat familiar or pretty familiar with our firm? Cool, so I'm not seeing a lot of hands here, which is a-okay. See a couple. Just trying to get an understanding for how much detail to go in. So that's great. Thank you all. Appreciate that. So Korn Ferry is a global human capital management consulting firm. So what that means is we partner with clients across the globe on all things people strategy. So really where talent and strategy or people and strategy intersect. So where other management consulting firms focus on mergers and acquisitions or other big kind of business challenges, we focus on what the people are doing. So if there's a merger or acquisition, how is an organization restructured? Or how do we measure effectiveness or measure engagement? Culture, company culture is such a big buzz term right now and has been for many years. How do we engage our talent at our client organizations? Of course, talent acquisition, which is where I sit, is how do we attract and hire talent, but then also how do we retain them? How do we develop our leaders? How do we develop succession plans for folks like you all who are coming out of such a great, strong school like USC? We want you to stay at our client organizations, not only for 1 or 2 years, we want you to grow and develop into leaders 5, 10 years down the road. And then finally, rewards and benefits. So how are we paying? How are we not only assessing talent, but how are we compensating them fairly, offering really robust benefits and rewards packages, paying for performance, all of that good stuff. So a whole lot of different things that all come into this, with some newer elements that have come into play in the last few years. The organization is now just about 50 years old. We celebrated our our 50th anniversary last year. Actually, we were founded in the 60s, so it was a 60s themed party. It was very fun. But global organization, headquartered right down the road from you all in Century City, with a presence in nearly every market across the globe. And just some stats here. I think, one of the more salient points here is really just how much of a global reach that we have, but that it's more than just data. We have some of the most comprehensive organization and people databases in the world. We've worked with the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies. So many of the other companies that are recruiting on USC's campus are our clients and our customers. And as I mentioned, we do have a presence across the globe. So, depending on how we work with clients, we might work with them in one capacity. We may be working with them in a number of different capacities, but just gives you an idea of kind of the span and scope of the work that we do within the talent and human capital consulting space. Again, just a snapshot of some of the clients that we work with, and you can really see the depth and the breadth of scope and scale. Some very, very large global clients, some smaller, very niche organizations. So just a little idea. I think, a lot of students that I speak with always do want to ask and want to understand, what kind of clients would I get to work with? And something that I love to share is that, right away, when you enter into the organization, no doubt you will be working on big scale client projects from day one. So I can certainly, speak to that. And I can say that my experience coming out of school was just like that as well. So before we really get into the meat of what we're going to talk about, I guess did want to just pause right there. I know it's harder being in a virtual environment, but curious what questions or what curiosities do you all have at the organization at large before we really dive into kind of how you all might fit in?
Nick Stewart here. I'm in the Master's in HR Management program. Do you guys recruit from that program, or do you just kind of do the school in general, or, because you're an HR consulting firm?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't necessarily do targeted recruiting efforts within the program specifically. However, we recruit on campus and through, virtual campus space. So while we don't do on-campus interviews, we go through our more streamlined process. Any and all students would be encouraged to apply for any of our positions, and I can go through that in a little bit as well. But we do look at all backgrounds. One of the things that I like the most actually about our organization is that our leaders are not just from HR or recruiting or consulting backgrounds that work in the professional services environment. We have people that have come from all sectors, all industries, all markets, and leverage their experience in a different way. So, for instance, I love using this example of we have a professional that a colleague that I work with who comes from, she spent a lot of time in France, and she has a biology background, and did not want to be doing that necessarily exactly that for the rest of her life, but wanted to instead be in a consulting environment. And so now she actually sits on site at one of our largest pharmaceutical companies. So she uses her biology expertise and leverages that, vernacular and the language that she knows from that space and from that experience. And then also, because they're headquartered overseas, she gets to leverage her knowledge, her vast knowledge of the French language as well. So, I think it's a good example of, while she's not a biologist, she is leveraging that experience to provide that expertise and leverage it in a client-facing environment, and I think builds that credibility with them. So bottom of the story is we do look at all backgrounds, all majors, all industries when we're hiring. Awesome. Other overall questions before we go forward here? Okay, awesome. So I did want to quickly touch on this, and I can certainly answer at the end, but if you are looking to graduate soon, or if you're part of a grad program that you entered into right after your undergrad, you would be eligible for our startup program, which is a full-time job that basically begins in a 6-week training program that goes into one of our career tracks, whether that be on the recruiting side of the business, the consulting side, or the business development or sales areas. So really great kind of training. Korn Ferry boot camp is what I like to call it. You know, really developing the consultant of the future. I went through a version of it when I graduated as well. Could not recommend it more because you're getting face-to-face interaction and an exposure to leaders across all lines of business. You know, if you're looking to stay in the LA area, or if you're looking to expand or go outside of the area, we have opportunities across the US for that as well. But it does begin with that 6-week training program. And then, you know, at the end of that, where you feel very well equipped to begin your full-time role, you're off and running, you go back to your respective location and begin work full-time. So did want to mention that our next class will begin in July of 2021. The training, that 6-week training period, does happen in Dallas, Texas. And then, like I said, you could either be based there and stay there, or go back to your respective location. More on that to come if there are questions on it, but I did want to mention that for any of you that are thinking, you know, I'm looking to graduate soon and I'm interested in a training program and a full-time job. Questions before we really move into the true meat and why you all are here, which is all about negotiation. All right. Okay, cool. So I'm going to take myself back into video here so I can see everybody. There was a question that was asked if we can record the session for later, and yes, this is being recorded for later, so we can get that sent out. And I don't know about a check-in link. There was another question about that. I'm not sure, but I am recording, so if you're here, you will be shown. Awesome. Okay, cool. So a question about negotiation. So how many of you all feel, by a show of hands, that you're expert negotiators, you could tackle really any negotiation setting and feel pretty confident? Great. I know I don't feel that way either. So, you know, there's always something to learn with regards to negotiation. How many of you all, you know, by a show of hands too, or, you know, feel free to speak out, have ever negotiated in a, you know, compensation, or, you know, whether that's an internship or a job type of setting, and negotiated anything like benefits or compensation or anything like that? Cool. Yeah, and I can definitely speak from my own experience. When I graduated, I did not negotiate either, was not really coached to do so whatsoever. And I can definitely say now that I would have approached the situation a bit differently had I been coached, or had I known a little bit more. So how many of you all, one last question before we dive in, how many of you all have had either a job or an internship in some capacity since you started at USC? Cool. Okay, so I'm seeing a few more hands here. Nice, nice. Yeah. So I guess then to really kind of get into this and talk a little bit about negotiation. So since having been in the recruiting space, and now I've been in the talent acquisition recruiting space for the past 5 years, definitely understand the importance of negotiating. And what I've learned now is how much doing so will show future employers that you're business savvy, that you've done your own research and that you have come to the table knowing a little bit more than you might have when you first started the process. So how might anybody have ideas on how might one do that kind of research? So if you're given a job offer for a position right out of school, let's say, what kind of research might you do? You're really excited about it. It's at a company that you've been looking forward to interviewing for. You've gone through the interview process. You're really excited. You might have some other things going on and might be in part of other processes, but what kind of research might you do? What questions might you ask before accepting?
You could ask about, or maybe do some research on the maybe median average salary to see if you're getting underpaid or overpaid.
Yeah, absolutely. So median average salary, kind of looking at a range, and where might you go for that? We've got, Veronica says, check Indeed, absolutely. Glassdoor for comparable ranges around the area for the roles, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, there's so many great online resources at your fingertips that you can access, like Indeed or Glassdoor, others as well. And one thing too to note with those is they're super, super helpful and insightful. They are also self-reported, so take that with a grain of salt, but definitely agree that you want to take a look at some of those sites. What else? What other kind of research might you do? Any anecdotal research or kind of conversations might you have with others? And some might even be on USC's campus.
You can maybe find someone that you know that has worked there, or maybe if you have a connection or someone who's also gone to USC, that could be a possible avenue.
Yes, awesome. Yes, definitely leverage that alumni network for sure. Yes, Trojans are always loving to help other Trojans, right? I know I've certainly seen that. So definitely leverage that alumni network. Anybody done a informational interview? Okay, we could talk about that too. Yeah, definitely reach out. Use LinkedIn, leverage the Career Center. There's so many great resources that you can tap into, not only within USC's Central Career Center, but your individual school or college within USC, whether it be Dornsife or Marshall or Viterbi or Bovard or whatever it might be. Absolutely. Anything else that comes to mind as far as doing research before having that kind of negotiation conversation?
Maybe the Career Center could help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the Career Center folks at USC have those connections, right, with the employers. They speak with them regularly. Even if they don't know all the ins and the outs of their new grad program or their positions, they know the culture. And I think someone mentioned looking at company culture and employee satisfaction. They have a better understanding for really what is the general temperature and the environment of this organization. So absolutely, yes. Yeah, so really good. So doing research on Indeed, Glassdoor, looking at compensation ranges, talking to the Career Center, leveraging your alumni network. I think we're all hitting on the big topics here, which is great. Anything else that we missed? Awesome. So that all really fits into doing your research, showing that you're business savvy, and really knowing your value. And it's less about, comparing yourself with, other people maybe that you've heard, but really having an understanding for that so that you can then go into the conversation knowing really what you bring to the table and what your individual value proposition might be. So if you want to think about, you know, on your own time, maybe think about, what do you bring to the table? What is your unique value proposition? You know, I like to think of like a commercial like ShamWow, or one of those that you can never forget, or the Snuggie, right? Because it's something so unusual that nobody ever saw before with the Snuggie or with the ShamWow. And you all individually bring such unique gifts to the companies that you'll be working for, or the nonprofits, or whatever it might be, you know, the grad programs that you might be going to. So think about what those individual elements are, and talents and gifts that you all possess that, that would bring your value up in that organization. Awesome. Okay, so we've done our research. We know what we bring to the table in a negotiation environment. How might you approach the conversation then with the recruiter? Show that you've done your due diligence, working with the market, providing that research. How might you approach that conversation with that recruiter? So as the recruiters say, hey, candidates, insert your name here. You know, we're looking forward to moving forward with you. You know, the title will be X, and the compensation will be X. And, you know, here is the additional information. What might be, you know, the first thing that comes out of your mouth as a result of that, or in response to that? Always comes back to please and thank you. That's what I always say. So leading with gratitude, leading with gratitude. And I actually have a great visual aid for this. I don't think you'll ever forget it once you see it. It's what I like to call the criticism sandwich. So you lead with gratitude. You always say thank you so much before you start to go into kind of what you might be asking about. So we talked about knowing your value, leading with gratitude, saying thank you so much, recruiter Miss. You know, really appreciate, you know, all of your support and, you know, coordination of my interviews up to this point. I really did want to talk a little bit more about the compensation if you have some time. Again, really appreciate the time that you've taken and the consideration, and I'm really looking forward to the prospect of moving forward for this opportunity. So you see how I really seamlessly went from thank you, which is that bread, right? That top, thank you so much. And then, you know, going into, I wouldn't call it criticism, but hey, I have a question about this portion of it. And then I end with my, again, thank you so much, reiterating that I'm very grateful, ending and leading with gratitude. So that nice sandwich. You'll also notice that I didn't use the word but or however. And I think that's so important, because as soon as you hear that, or if you're setting yourself up to say, well, you know, I really like this offer, but whatever you say after that, you know, is going to probably be met with some criticism. And it goes for really anything in life, right? If you say, if someone asks you, like, what do you think of, you know, these new shoes that I got? Well, you know, I really like the color, but everything you're going to say after that is going to be negative, right? So that criticism sandwich, I really like to think about. So thinking then about the range that you have in mind. So I'll use a really easy value because I just think it's easier to look at, right? And I'll just say 100,000. So let's say you believe you're worth 100,000 when you graduate from your, let's say, your engineering program, your engineering grad program. I'll just use that as an example for any engineers that are here today. And you know, you might get an offer that's, let's say, is just maybe not quite what you're looking for there. What might you say? Do you think you would say, you know, here's, I want exactly 100,000, or how might you approach that conversation? Any ideas?
One approach could be that if you want 100,000, like maybe this is ambitious and wrong, but like you could ask for maybe more than that and then see if 100,000 is where you can meet in the middle. But it also can maybe anger or maybe kind of dissuade the recruiter also.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I definitely would say, to aim a little bit higher, but also I would say to keep it in a range, right? So if you're really looking for something around 100 and after doing your research, that that's what you're worth, put that at the end or kind of the bottom of your range. So again, leading with gratitude, thank you so much, recruiter so-and-so, did have a question, about the compensation. I think based on my research, based on some of the research that I've done, I understand that, people in my position might be worth, or rather people in my position may be being offered something between, maybe 100 and 115, or 100 and 112, or 105 and 120, whatever it might be, whatever that range might look like. And typically the higher the compensation value, the bigger the range might be. So if it's something in the 50 range, let's say you're really looking for something in the low 60s, let's say, and they offer you 50, you might say, I think, based on the research that I've done, I think a lot of folks, I understand a lot of folks that are being offered positions in this same space, in the same industry, are being offered something between 60 and 67,000. And then, go from there. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. So we talked about, sharing again here, we talked about that criticism sandwich, showing and talking to a recruiter, showing that you've done that market due diligence, and then providing that range to your recruiter once that compensation conversation commences. When might you, if the recruiter hasn't brought up, this is another question, if the recruiter has not brought up compensation before the final offer, when they're offering you the position, when might you think is a appropriate time to bring that up?
Would it be like when for me at least, it seems ambitious, like if you're still interviewing, to be talking about compensation. So maybe potentially, maybe after you receive the offer and then maybe can approach for compensation, or maybe wait for the recruiter to give you a number. I'm not sure.
I agree, Brian. I think you're right on the money there. I would definitely say wait until that offer, at least till the verbal offer is presented. I would say yes, absolutely. Agreed. As a recruiter, especially for something that is more entry level or internship, it is sometimes off-putting to hear that question asked right in the first phone screen, or even, when they're being coordinated, when the interviews are being coordinated with the hiring manager. So I would definitely wait. Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and I think this is something too that is a little bit of a taboo topic, which is why I really like talking about it and really like, asking questions about this, because again, it's not something that's necessarily talked about. It's not something I know I was not coached on when I was in school. So hopefully this helps, kind of make this less of a taboo topic. One other thing that I didn't mention is, this concept of being willing to walk away. And I say this with a little bit of caution, with someone that's out of, coming right out of school. And, I'm more focused that towards someone who is, a little bit more senior in their career. But something just also to keep in mind of, if you know that you will not accept a position, you do not want to accept a pay cut later on in your career, and you know what you're worth, be willing to walk away, and be willing to, believe that the next best opportunity is waiting, around the corner. But I do say that with a little bit of caution, coming right out of school. What other questions on negotiation are there?
I had a question about after maybe compensation and rescinding. So if let's just say that you want $100,000, but the recruiter offers you like 85.
Mm-hmm.
If you ask for a certain amount of money, has there ever been a time, or is it commonplace in the practice for the recruiter to maybe just rescind your offer because you want a higher compensation and they might offer your position to someone else? Like, how common is that?
Sure. So that would, once your offer has been verbally offered to you, that, I mean, and for compliance, specifically for compliance reasons, but also just in general, that really shouldn't happen unless you've had that conversation with the recruiter. So, you know, if the company is audited in any way by what is the OFCCP or audited by other means, by other organizations, you know, that should not happen. You know, if it happens, you know, there may be other reasons, but typically, you know, if they're rescinding your offer, they will say, well, you know, at this time, you know, thank you so much. You know, it has been, you know, a pleasure to speak with you, you know, given, you know, what you're expecting in terms of compensation. I don't think this is, you know, I don't think this is something that, you know, is necessarily a good fit, you know, but they will give you the opportunity to say, they will give you the opportunity, or they should give you the opportunity to say that, you know, I'm not wanting to move forward at this time due to compensation. So if they don't ask you that, you know, I definitely would make sure to be clear of whether or not, you know, you're willing to accept, you know, something a little bit lower than what you had in mind, you know, moving forward. You know, then, you know, it might be, especially with someone right out of school, I always like to hear the question of, okay, you know, still really excited to accept this position, you know, and excited to learn. I guess would love to maybe speak with the hiring manager or get a little better understanding to what my development plan might look like. So, you know, if I prove, you know, to be, to really be excelling, and if I am consistently providing value and insight to my team, you know, what will that look like in 6 months or in 1 year's time, or maybe even in 3 months' time? What is the bonus structure like? What is the merit increase? You know, what is the promotion cycle? Is that something that happens just once a year? Is that something that happens based on performance? There's just so many different nuances to that within an organization. And, you know, being curious and asking those questions is really, again, going to show how business savvy you are. And, you know, it's less about this, you know, one offer and more about, okay, well, I'm interested. It shows that, hey, I'm interested in growing within the organization. How do I do that? How do I ensure that I provide value, and then, you know, in turn, hopefully I'm rewarded by that? Yeah, that's a really good question. Other questions? Anyone have curiosities on like benefits or things like that? Negotiation of benefits. I will say I have a little bit less, because I don't work in executive search, I have a little bit less experience with like stock options and things like that, which you will deal with later on in your career when you're a little bit more senior. So I definitely encourage you to do some more research on that, you know, as the years go by, because that is certainly a big component of accepting an offer, you know, when you're more senior in your career, is, you know, what are the stock options, et cetera. But I think asking, you know, again, in that final conversation when the position is offered to you, asking those questions of, you know, could you share a little bit more about, you know, the health and wellness insurance, or, you know, other perks that I can look forward to as part of being a part of your organization?
I had one more question about offer deadlines and extensions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah,
So
that's a good
outside of
question.
maybe negotiating, Sometimes like you have an interview and you don't want to say no to a certain job because you don't know when your next job is going to come. But you want to give yourself the most amount of time to decide on the offer in case something else comes. What is it like trying to negotiate like deadlines for acceptance, and what is that process like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've seen it work a couple of different ways. So if it is a true just fresh grad recruiting program with a true cycle of, all of the hires for next summer are done, signed, sealed, delivered by November 1st. We see that 2-week deadline being really true, typically. So, Big Four, consulting, any clients in that space, we typically give the 2-week deadline of being able to accept or decline that offer. If it's something that is, again, if you're a little bit more senior, or if it's a position that's not necessarily in that true structure or cycle, or if it's a position within a company that is not doing as much on-campus early career recruiting, we're seeing more of a standard like 3-day deadline or so, or typically like by the end of the week, or if it's on a Thursday or Friday, by Monday, something like that. Give it the weekend, think it over, talk to your family, et cetera, about that. That's more akin to what we would give more of a senior, someone who's a little bit more senior in their career. Because I can say from experience, working with colleagues in like the pro search or the executive search side of our business, typically it's, a few days time. So it varies, I will say. But definitely doesn't hurt to ask. And honestly shows respect for the recruiter in saying, I'm not ready right now to respond. I'm so grateful, so thankful that we've gotten to this point, and really appreciate, I'm really excited about the prospect of this opportunity. I am interviewing for another organization. I want to be sure to, to respect their process as well. When do you want to hear back from me on this? I think that's a really fair question for sure. Does that help answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sweet. And in other cases too, especially in more of a niche market, and I don't know, Brian, if you're in Marshall or where you're studying, but in a very niche market, particularly within product development, for some of our like product engineers, where it is just very niche, I have seen that be a little bit more flexible based on the talent sometimes. Cool, other questions? I am curious, I guess, show of hands, how many of y'all are Marshall? So really just 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4, okay, cool. And then how many of y'all are from Dornsife? 1, 2, 3, okay. Cool. And then the Turby, do you have any engineers in the house? Nice. I hired a lot of engineers. We've got 2 working on behalf of some of our clients. So awesome. And then what did I miss? Bovard. I know we have someone from Bovard. They may have left. What am I missing?
Oh, I'm from Annenberg.
Oh, Annenberg. I'm sorry. Awesome. What are you studying at Annenberg?
Actually, a grad student, a Master's of Communication Management.
Cool. Awesome. It's such a great school. Cool. Awesome. What other questions? I'm going to look in the chat because I think there were some other questions. We had a question about sponsoring H-1B. For the new grad program, we do not sponsor H-1B. I can't speak to other Korn Ferry positions within the US. For the program, we do not. However, we do have, like I said, colleagues all across the world. So, you know, if there is a specific position that you're looking for, you know, chances are, especially if it's a recruiter or consultant position, we most likely have an opening of some sort in other countries as well. And Alex, did you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask really quickly about negotiating salary. So does it matter if you put your number out first? Like, is it important for you to give out a number before the person interviewing you does? Does that really matter or play into it? Does that have anything to do with who can control the salary conversation, or is it different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually like to put it back on the recruiter. That's actually what I suggest to do as well, because who knows, you know, the research that you may have done, you know, may not have covered this one niche industry or one specific area, and you may actually be giving a lower value than maybe what they would be giving. And then they might actually go a little bit lower on the continuum, right, of the range that they can look at. So if you ever speak with a compensation expert, they'll be able to tell you a lot about all of the bands and the levels, but typically each position within a certain band or level within the organization has a true minimum, and I think someone mentioned that, and then a true maximum, and then something in between. And so really anything is fair game within that entire range or continuum. So if I'm asked, if as a candidate, right, kind of turning the tables, if someone says, you know, what are you looking for, or what are you anticipating? I might actually try to say, you know, I've done a little bit of research, definitely curious to learn a little bit more about, you know, what the role entails, what some of the responsibilities are, what the expectations are of the position, and really how that measures up within your organization, you know, before I say for sure, especially if it's the first conversation. That's my personal opinion, and then see what they come back with and say. Another thing is, in a handful of states, including California, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, I believe, and maybe Oregon, I want to say, recruiters are not able to ask candidates what they currently make. So this doesn't necessarily affect you if you are about to graduate from undergrad, but if you've had a job or a few jobs, and you know, they're curious to know what you currently make, they're only able to ask you what you're expecting or what you are anticipating or hoping to make. So just something to be aware of. And I think that will be kind of universal. And I know I work with a lot of recruiters. So, you know, we've been all trained pretty much to ask the latter question of, what do you expect? What are you anticipating to make in this next job? So that's a very good question, Alex. I hope I answered that for you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, really good question. Okay, we have a question in the chat of, would recent grads with a couple years work experience still be eligible for the startup program? Definitely depends. I would say, Jennifer, we see some recent grads with like 1 year of experience or less being eligible. You know, I certainly think this upcoming year is going to be a little bit different in that we might see someone with a little bit more than 1 year, or if you've done, you know, your undergrad and then you have 1 or 2 years of grad school, then, you know, definitely still would be eligible. But I would say apply, or, you know, take a look at some of the other opportunities that we have, especially if it's, you know, if it's a recruiter or, you know, consultant kind of role. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of level for that. What do you recommend? Another question. What do you recommend putting if a job application asks about salary expectations? Yeah, this is a very good question. And if it's required, you do have to put it. I would say if it's not required, just leave it. And if it is required, I would say a lot of the time, those questions that you're kind of how the whole applicant tracking system works is typically it's kind of a boilerplate of, here are all the questions that, you know, this particular applicant tracking system is requiring us to ask these candidates. And at the end of the day, your resume will hold a lot more weight or salience than your salary. speaking from my own experience in looking through thousands of applications, I rarely look at anything other than literally the first third of a resume. And then if I like what I'm seeing compared to the job, I will continue looking through the rest of the profile on the applicant tracking system. And I think a lot of that is so determinate based on the conversation, based on the hiring manager, based on, so I would probably say something akin to what you're looking for. I wouldn't probably go higher actually than what you're looking for. I would stay in that kind of like that mid-range of, so if you're looking for 60,000, I might put 60,000. That's just my recommendation. I think other recruiters or others that look through a lot of resumes or that go through a lot of applications, depending on the level, might say something very different. So I would encourage you, depending, I forget who asked that question, but depending on kind of where you are in your career, if you're leaving undergrad or, if you're a graduate, I think it might depend. So we'll definitely continue asking that question. But in my personal experience, do I really look at that ever? No. So I'm just making sure I got to all these questions here. Other questions, curiosities, anything else? That went by so fast. We only have 10 more minutes. Anyone have a job that they're currently, looking at or assessing or an offer? Oh, we were going to talk about informational interviews. Aha, that's what we're going to talk about. Informational interviews are awesome. Anyone have a definition of that or want to explain what that is? Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically it's anytime a candidate, whether that be someone in school or not, reaches out to someone asking truly about their job, not necessarily for a particular role, although it could lead to that. But it's more so asking a specific question or asking for some specific feedback about their profile or their candidacy in some way. So this can come in the form of a LinkedIn request. I think a great exercise is reaching out to someone whose job you want, who's an alum of USC. So that could be something as simple as going on LinkedIn and typing in what we call a Boolean search. And I'll actually put this in the chat. So you can look it up later, but like a Boolean search string. So let's say I'm doing, I'm saying USC and I'll use Annenberg, oops, and communication management, is that right? And maybe I really want to work at Mattel. They're a client and they're also in El Segundo. So, maybe I really want to work there. So I'm going to put that in the chat. So that's what I put into that LinkedIn search bar. And what will come up is hopefully anybody who has any of those qualifications, right? Or anybody who has all of those keywords in their profile on LinkedIn. Sometimes I might spell out University of Southern California. Maybe I'll spell out Annenberg all the way, School of blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, you will see that. Then you can also specify, okay, I want someone who graduated, in these years, or I want someone who was a part of my a cappella group or in my Greek organization or what have you, or my professional fraternity, business fraternity, whatever it is. And then you can reach out to someone whose job you want, basically, and reach out, of course, with a specific purpose, asking them, maybe a specific question about, what they do, or, maybe you run a student organization at USC and you want them to speak, do kind of a virtual program session, something like that. Whatever it might be, but it could lead to a job. It totally could just be a fun conversation, or it could lead to a job, or it could lead to another conversation or an internship or whatever it might be. But reaching out again with a specific purpose can never hurt. The worst thing that could happen is they say no. And if you want to ask for an informational interview, you could have, take them to coffee or virtual coffee or whatever it might be, and ask them questions, after USC, what were the steps that you took to get to Mattel? What do you suggest with me, with my background, or, again, reaching out with that kind of specific purposeful need or purposeful question. But that's an informational interview. I'm a big fan. That's how I got, honestly, my job and all the internships that came before that. So definitely I'm a big fan of it. And honestly, at the end of the day, like, these people are going to be very honored, right? That you reached out, and it gives them the opportunity to relive, sometimes their college days, right? And so, you're gifting them. It's a win-win.
I had a question about these informational interviews.
Yeah.
So if let's just say like you have to do an informational interview with like an analyst or associate or someone who's been at the company for only like a few years, like how much of that kind of really impacts, like your resume or something like that, going from like, the drop stage to like the first round, just that, they're analysts. So of course they're not in HR, so they don't have like recruitment, like executive powers, of course. So how do you kind of like use, or how do you bridge from trying to like get informational interviews to your resume getting picked up and being eligible for first rounds or super days or anything like that?
Yeah. So, I would say any and all information interviews can certainly be very valuable, and you can be great information gathering sessions for you. Because you never know, someone who's, an analyst or consultant who's 3 years out of school, in 2 years, they might be managing a team, in 3 to 5 years, they might, have direct connection with, leaders or what have you. So I'll say that, and then two, if you have a personal connection, that is, or if you can make a personal connection, maybe that is someone that has a little bit more experience, that might be managing a team or managing a line of business, definitely would say shoot for that. They can, perhaps have more of a connection and be able to influence or, get your resume in front of the right people. So any and all of the above, but yeah, any opportunity for you to learn or connect with someone that works for the company can be extremely valuable, whether that's just learning about, management style or culture or, communication or lack thereof, at this organization could be extremely insightful or extremely valuable. And you never know who they might be passing the resume on to, who might be passing it on to someone else. I have a great example of this, working for a client who, we had a student who went right from undergrad to doing her PhD in polymer engineering, actually. And she had just reached out to someone who was in research and development within the organization as a medical device company. And she noticed that he had published some research and was really impressed by it, and simply reached out and just said, hey, I saw that you put out this research. I'm studying this at my university. I'm actually writing my thesis on it, et cetera, et cetera. Just wanted to reach out and just say how much I appreciated it, and spoke to some really specific technical thing that I probably couldn't replicate right now. But called out some really specific details within the paper or the published work. And of course, the person at the company was like thrilled by it and immediately responded, and then flagged this person's resume, got it in front of their leader. It somehow made its way all the way up to like head of R&D, because they were so impressed by her findings. And it was just a simple LinkedIn reach out. And at that time, they were doing very little hiring at this organization at the time, but they were kept on prioritizing this candidate's resume. And now she's been there for 5 years or 6 years, something like that, and is now leading other people. So it definitely can happen, and it definitely can lead to success. A lot of really good questions. Anything else that we're curious about here? I'll go ahead and leave my email again for y'all to reach out. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, or if you want to talk some more or anything like that. But like I said, we do, if you are interested in the new grad program, we do have that coming up next summer. We have other positions as well, that pop up for other capacities too. So let me know if you have questions, and because I do work with our clients too, if you have questions about what is this like at this type of organization or that type of organization, feel free to drop me a line. But it's great to meet all of you, and thanks for coming by. Wish we could shake hands.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allie.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.